Would you guys join me in a word of prayer? And Jesus, what we're looking at in this series is we're asking the question of who are you? Why do you matter? What do you have to offer to us today? And I know today's topic will speak to some because there are people in this room who feel a little lost, who feel like they're drowning, like the roof is leaking. And maybe this morning what they need to hear is how good you are and how you are there for them. And so I'm asking, Father, would your Holy Spirit just move in our midst? May you guide the words that come out of my own mouth to be your words, to be filled with you, so that we might see you a little bit clearer, and we might walk out of here saying, how great are you? It's in your name I pray. Amen. So, I tell a lot of stories about hiking from time to time, and that's just natural given from where I grew up. I grew up in the Smoky Mountains, while here, a big passion for everybody is hunting. For me, no one really hunted. We all hiked because you're in the Smoky Mountains. That's just what you do. So I've told a lot of stories over the years about hiking, but I've got an honest confession to make. I have a tendency to get lost on trails and in the woods. I'm sure, if you ever were to go on a hike with me, that would probably happen. You'd be like, Mason, I will never, ever again go in the woods with you ever again. We're going to get lost. It's going to be crazy. This happens not just once. This has been a recurring thing. I would make a terrible Boy Scout or companion in the woods. The very first time I ever got lost, I think I was 14 or so, I was with my buddies Evan and Robert. We had decided that we were going to take this big journey up on top of this mountain. I can't remember what the mountain was or the trail, but we knew it was going to be a long hike, and so we'd hit the trail at dawn. We hiked for hours. It was a beautiful day. The trail was clear. And, there were people passing by. We could, make jokes with them. We get up to the top of this mountain above the clouds. We enjoy a lunch of trail mix and Pop-Tarts, and we start goofing off and making jokes about going to push each other off the mountain. And then before long, those jokes actually turn into a wrestling match, and we're actually just trying to push each other off the mountain, typical teenage guy stuff. And we get to a point where we're like, okay, well, at the time it is, if we're going to make it home for dinner, we need to start heading back now. But we realized in our time of enjoying the mountaintop experience that some clouds had moved in below where we were. So when we start hiking back down, we realized that the trail that once was clear was now obscured. It was a little bit foggy. It was a little bit hard to see where you're going to step. You could see only about 5 or 10 feet ahead of you. We knew that there were other people around other trails, but you couldn't see them. You might hear them, but you couldn't see them. It was hard enough just to see one another. We're constantly tripping. We're constantly trying to figure out where we are. There's this constant feeling that maybe we're not heading in the right direction. If this is kind of like when you're, looking forward to graduating or getting married or starting a new job, and then it happens, and then you're like, whoa, okay, where do I go from here? Things look a little scary, or the happily ever after, you're like, wow, there's actually work involved after the wedding day to make this happily ever after, right? Yeah, or when you graduate and you're like, all you're thinking about is to be an adult and graduate, and you get to be an adult and you're like, this was the worst mistake I've ever made in my life, right? Who ever thought adulting was fun? And, as a kid, you're like, this is great. But this is how we felt. We were going down this mountain and we're like, this was a great adventure, but now it's a little bit more difficult. Now we're not quite sure if we're even in the right, lane or the right trail anymore. And then we arrive at this campsite and it hit us. We were lost because we hit a campsite and we had never hit any campsite on the way up there. And we start to talk to people and they're like, yeah, you're on the wrong side of the mountain. And we're looking at the clock and we're like, it's about to get dark. And the car is miles away on the other side of this mountain range. And we got to figure out how we're going to get back. We were lost. And I bring this up because maybe for some of you, that's how you feel right now. You started in some journey, something in your life that had you excited, and you looked at it and you're like, this is a promising future, but you get into it and all of a sudden you feel like, man, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. You took a wrong turn somewhere, or you're just like, this marriage was wonderful, but now we're in a difficult place, or my finances, I don't know how this is going to get any better, or maybe with your kids or with your job, but there's something in your life that makes you feel a little lost at the moment. And that can be tough to mention, because we live in an age where people give you the impression that you've got to have everything figured out. When people ask, hey, how are you doing? You just instinctively say, fine. Not, man, I'm not sure of many things right now. Because you're feeling a little lost. But what if I was to propose to you that there might be someone out there who was like a guide, like a park ranger for life. Someone who had words of wisdom that had stood the test of time, that had the heart to guide us through our wilderness. Would that not be someone worth listening to? Would that not be someone whose advice and guidance, direction, that we would be like, yeah, I need this? You know, today we're continuing in our 90 Days with Jesus series that we kicked off last week. And if you weren't with us, once again, that's okay. I'm glad you were here. In this series, once again, we're challenging you every single day. Join us in reading along with us through the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, the 4 biographies that we know of as the Gospels that were written by eyewitnesses who recorded what happened. And we're going through this journey because we're asking the question, who is Jesus? Why does he matter? What does he have to offer us today? And so in this, maybe you took our challenge seriously last week, and so you sat down with your family, and you're like, yes, we watched this little video each day, and now we're going to sit down as a family, and we're going to read this each night, a chapter together, and you got your camera, you're ready to take a photo of your family. You open up, and then you see so-and-so was the son of so-and-so, was the son of so-and-so, was the son of so-and-so, and maybe you're sitting there thinking, I have made a grave mistake. Right? Like maybe some of you are like, gosh, I have no idea how to pronounce any of these names or what's going on. Let's just skip this part. Let's get to something good, right? Maybe for some of you that was your experience when we started this. But let me go and explain to you what happened and what all that happened this week that we saw in Jesus and how that leads into what we're talking about today in Matthew chapter 7. So Matthew opened up with that genealogy because he's not talking to you and I. He's talking to people 2,000 years ago, a Jewish audience who would have immediately picked up on everything he's saying because they were seeing their ancestors. And they would remember in the Hebrew Bible how God had interacted with each of these individuals, kept promising them that he loved them, that he cared for them, that he was going to use them and work through them to bring about the Messiah upon the world who was going to be the ultimate king, God's true and final king, the king of the universe who's going to set this world right. And so they would have read this and understood that Matthew's saying that God has kept his promises because he's brought us Jesus. But as soon as Jesus shows up on the scene, he's a baby and things immediately start to go kind of crazy. So you get some kings from foreign nations who come to want to worship him, but other kings are like, no, we got to kill this guy because everyone understood that at that time that a king had come who had the right to have authority over all things, and that means no neutrality. You're either, yes, we're on board, or we want to kill him. Right? And so that's what Matthew's presenting right off the bat. But God protects his king and he raises him up. And we start to see that not only is Matthew trying to show us that he's the king of the universe, but that he's also the true and better Israel. You see, if you might have picked up on some similarities in the story between Jesus and the ancient story of Israel. So God had selected a special people group known as the Israelites. He'd given them a purpose. He says, through you, I'm going to fix this world. But they found that they were just as much a part of the problem. But now we see this Jesus, just like God has given Israel purpose, he shared that same purpose with Jesus. Just like Israel spent time in Egypt, so did Jesus. Just like Israel suffered under the hands of a genocidal tyrant, so did Jesus. Just like God told Israel, you are my special son, he said the same thing to Jesus. Just like Israel spent time in the wilderness being tempted and failed, so did Jesus, but he didn't fail, he succeeded. And we're supposed to get from this that God is doing something new, that he's fulfilling his promises even to Israel through one man, through Jesus. And it's to make us see and to ask the question that if God had presented this massive exodus through Israel about how he freed them through slavery, then there's a possibility that a new exodus is taking place in Jesus. That God is on the mission once again to free his people from slavery in his Messiah. And as that question should be running through your mind, that observation, we see Jesus, he starts gathering a crowd. He starts telling people, come and be part of God's new family, something he called the kingdom of heaven. And the people he's inviting are the worst people he could possibly have found. Right? Like he finds the losers, the outcasts, the people who are broken, the people who have made countless mistakes, the people that other people overlooked and said, there's nothing good for you. He's like, no. God wants you in a special family. Come and be a part of it. And then like Moses long ago, who went up on a mountain and gave the 10 Commandments and God's way of life to the Israelites, Jesus goes up on a mountain and he starts to talk about here's what it looks like to be part of God's family now. And he gives a message known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's a very famous sermon, but it's one of those that if you and I were there, we would have been really offended and probably would want to kill him because of the things he's saying. Because he takes their sacred law and he's like, you've heard these interpretations, you've heard this message, but I have a new message for you. You thought this was what God wanted of your life, but let me tell you, I have a new way for you. This is what this really means. He even has the audacity to point to their Hebrew Bible and say, everything you've read was really about me. And then, after he's presenting in this message a new way of life, a way of life that is about generosity and mercy and compassion for others. A way of life that if you're reading it carefully, maybe you're like, I want to live like that. I want to be a part of a community like that. A community that was forgiving of one another. A community that was gracious and merciful. A community that had an endowed purpose upon them from the God Almighty. I want to be a part of that. Jesus ends his message with probably the most controversial and upsetting things that he could possibly say. Words at the end of chapter 7 that, I'll be honest, have haunted me many times. Words that we need to read now, remembering that the weight of these words are only real if he is in fact the Messiah, that if he is in fact God's true and final king, if he is in fact the one who speaks on behalf of God, that God has sent to rescue humanity, these words only have power if that is true. I believe it's true. And I hope you do too. But what that means that these next few words might be very scary. They might be rather uncomfortable for us. But I trust that Jesus told these words long ago to people like us who maybe felt a little lost, who maybe felt like the weight of the world was on their shoulders. People who felt like when they looked at their past were full of more mistakes than success, more failures than wins. People who just want to know, man, am I going the right way? These words, I think Jesus says, they're uncomfortable, but they're for people of that state to really encourage them when you look at it. So he starts off by saying this in chapter 7 of Matthew's Gospel. If you want to follow along with us in your own Bible, in verse 21, he says this. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, that's really depressing. After he's just talked about this amazing new community, this family that he's building. And he's like, in my family that I'm building, that I'm king over, it's a place of forgiveness, it's a place of purpose, it's a place of love and mercy and grace. And you would be like, yes, I want to live in a place like that. But he stops, he's like, not everyone who thinks that they're part of it is actually a part of it. Meaning that you could very well think, man, I'm good with God, but not actually be good with God. And this is easy to do. Think about it in our day and age. This would be like if you're like, man, I'm good with God because I came to church, because I suffered a sermon through Mason. I sang a few songs. I'm a good person, therefore I'm good with God. That would be really offensive, what Jesus just said then, if that's your mindset. Think about how it was for the original audience. He's talking to a Jewish audience, people who believe that they are good with God because they were born into the right family. They were the right people. They were the chosen people. So they would sit there and think, I'm good with God because I'm Jewish, because I was born into this family. And yet the thing that Jesus is saying here, he's like, this is like when you're lost in the woods and a park ranger comes up to you and says, hey, I noticed you're lost. Can I help guide you home? And you stop and you're like, don't you know who I am? Right? Like there's no way I could possibly be lost. I grew up around here. I know all these things. I have all the special skills and talents, and I'm someone who will never ask for directions when I'm lost because I never get lost, right? Like that's the equivalent of what Jesus is saying here. Like, when a park ranger notices you're lost in the woods and you try to say, no, I'm not lost because don't you know who I am? That's essentially what Jesus is saying here in this moment. That there are going to be plenty of people who think that they are not lost because of who they are. In reality, they are. And then he carries over and says this. Backing up, verse 21, read the whole thing. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Now, clearly, Jesus isn't one for empty words. He's like, man, it's good that you have faith. It's good that you believe, but what is your faith really doing? Like, it's one thing to say, man, I believe in you, Jesus, but, you're not really my thing. So I'll just say that to make myself feel a little good or a little safe and secure. Right, if you actually read the New Testament, writers like James talks about like, man, you say you believe in God. That's great. So did the demons. What makes you different? Man, believing doesn't really do anything. Faith in action does something. It's one thing to say, I have faith in Jesus. That faith in Jesus is real if it has a real impact upon who you are, how you treat yourself, how you treat others, the things you do in this world. That's when our faith is real. We can say it all day long, I believe. But is our belief doing something? That's what Jesus is saying here. He's like, you can say, Lord, Lord, but are you doing something with this faith? Now, here's where the trap comes in. It is so easy to hear a moment like that. And I imagine Jesus can take a pause here. And the people maybe who are hearing it might have been thinking, yeah, you tell them, Jesus. You need to tell all these other people they need to get off their lazy butt and get involved and do things, right? They need to be like me. It'd be so easy for people in that audience to say that. To be able to look around at maybe the other Jewish members of their community and say, man, Jesus, you need to tell that to them. Can you say that again to them, Jesus? Because I'm doing all the work over here, but they're not getting involved. And here's the thing. 2,000 years later, Jesus followers, we can say the same thing. We can come into a church space. We can work ourselves to the bone, never ask for help, and then stop and be bitter towards other members in our church family and say, man, if those people, they just need to get off their lazy butt. I'm doing all the work over here. Can't they see? And that's what Jesus pointed out. Because he says this, targeting that crowd. In the next sentence, he says this. And this is uncomfortable. He says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? Right? He's like, man, there's going to be many people who are going to have a Christian resume. You know, the people who are like, let me tell you about all the mighty things I've did for God. Not, here's what God has done, but let me tell you what I have done for God, right? Like, that's what he's talking about. He's like, there's going to be many people who are going to come before God one day and are going to be like, Jesus, I'm good because I've done all these good things. Don't worry, I did them for you. In reality, you really did them for yourself and just threw Jesus on that. He's like, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have a Christian resume, but they're still going to be lost. See, this would be like if you're lost in the woods and a park ranger came up to you and was like, hey, man, I know you're lost. Can I help you guide you? And they're like, no. There's no way I could be lost because I've done this trail and this trail and this trail, and I've been to these classes and these courses, and I've traveled all these places in the country and things like that. So there's no way in this present moment that I'm lost, right? That's the equivalent of what this crowd is saying. And so to that crowd, here's what Jesus says, and this is probably the scariest phrase, I think, in the entire Bible. Verse 23, he says, to that crowd, he says this, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. This is not a comfortable thing to hear from Jesus. But he's being incredibly insulting in some ways to his audience, stating like, look, there are some of you who are lost, who don't realize you're lost because you're building your identity on things that assure you that you're a good person, that you are not lost, that you aren't in trouble, or because you're denying the fact that you're lost. Or you're sitting here thinking, I'm good with God because of all the many good things I do, so therefore God owes me. He's like, to both categories, man, you guys are lost. See, the truth is we are all lost and we are all in need of a guide. And if Jesus was to end his message there, he's like, okay, go home, go enjoy some fried chicken, have a good day and things like that. We'd be like, whoa, okay, where's the hope in this? Where you basically in your message was like, here's this great community, this thing I'm building, and by the way, none of you are part of it. Go home. That would be incredibly encouraging. But he has the intent to encourage. So he follows it up with saying this. He says this. He says, everyone then who hears these words of mine, meaning you've heard them, you've chewed over them, you've listened to them with the intent of believing that he is, in fact, the king of the universe speaking on behalf of God, so you're listening carefully to what he has to say. And then you do this, and does them, meaning we don't just hear what Jesus says, but we take what he says, and then we actually do them. If we only do the first part, then we might as well be a toddler who's ignoring their parent, right? But we hear what God has to say, we hear what Jesus has to say, and then we do it. We put into practice his way of life. He describes it like this. That person will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Think about this. This makes perfect sense. If you're lost and you encounter a park ranger, and the park ranger says, don't worry, I know how to get us out of this. Follow me. If you follow his instructions, you will get out. That's what Jesus is proposing. He's like, guys, you guys are all lost, but I have the way out. If you will follow me, and if we obey, then we're going to find our way out. That's what he's proposing to his audience. And he describes it as building your house on a rock, which this is going to go super Bible geek nerd mode over here. But that phrase was highly political and dangerous even to say. Because that phrase, house on the rock, always referred back to one thing in that day and age, the temple. You see, in that day and age, the temple was the most sacred place on the planet. It was a place where only there could you encounter God. Only there could you find your way home. Only there could you find your answers. Only there could you find grace and mercy and peace. And here's Jesus saying, if you follow my way, it's better than the way that you have always experienced. He's putting himself in the place of God in this moment. That his teachings are higher than even the temple teachings of his day. That was the moment that you and I would have been like, let me find a rock. Like, I got to hit this guy, right? But he fully believed, and here's the thing. Many people did not believe him in this. Many people are like, Jesus, that was great. You said some great things, but I don't know if I believe you. And he kept going on and on. He's like, guys, I'm going to die. I'm going to be crucified by my own people. I'm going to be resurrected. And they're like, that's great and all. But here's the thing. He proved it. He pulled it off. And so then people came along behind. And they're like, man, he said this about this way of life. And he fulfilled what he promised about dying and being resurrected. So I'm going to follow him. And so people started to believe that if they built their life upon the teachings of Jesus, to follow him, that it was the equivalent of building their house on the rock. And here's why he says this is so important. Here's where you really get to see the heart of Jesus on why he's been teaching this and what he wants us to gain from his lessons when we apply his way of life to our life. Here's why. It's because he says this in verse 25. He says, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. See, Jesus doesn't sugarcoat it. He's like, man, this life is tough. This life has a way of breaking you again and again. It has a way of tearing things down. It has a way of making you feel like you're drowning. It has a way of making you feel like you're lost. And he's not saying if you follow me, those will never happen. But he is giving a promise in the midst of it. He's like, these things are going to come, but you can go through them together with a guide who is there with you, who is guiding you through this. That's what he's saying. He's like, guys, and he's talking to people who are feeling oppression, people who are losing everything to the Romans. And he's like, guys, this is bad, but I want to guide you through this. Just like he says it to us. That life has a way of throwing curveballs and knocking us at the knees and tearing us down. And he's not promising, guys, if you follow me, that will never happen to you. He says, when it happens, I'm going to guide you through it. This is what I'm building. And it's like building your house on a rock for when those storms come. And in contrast, he says this. He says, and everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So the message for all of us, and that is like, if we build our lives on Jesus' teaching, we will be part of the house that lasts forever. That he has come to guide us back home through the storms, through the chaos, through the moments where we feel like we're lost, through the moments we feel like we're drowning, through the moments where it feels like the house, the roof is caving in. He's like, man, I've come to help guide you through those moments. And here's the thing. The things he is saying are incredibly controversial. Because in that day and age, when someone came to speak from God, they're like, Moses said this, and God has given this a message. And Jesus doesn't do that. He puts himself in the place of God. He says, this is the way. And if we accept that he is in fact the king of all things, that he is God's true and final king, the king of the universe, who has been sent here to rescue us, sent here to free us, and to guide us back home, then that's where the weight comes in. That's when the rubber meets the road. And the audience there understood that. Because here's how they responded. We're told in verse 28, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. That means we have one of two ways to really respond to this Jesus. Like neutrality is no longer an option. It's like when you don't like to be strung along by people, right? You don't like people to play games with you, to give you false promises, to tell you, I'll be there, but then they never show up, right? No one likes that. And here's the thing. Neither does Jesus, right? Like he doesn't want us to be playing on the fence, waiting for when we'll reel him in when the time is right. He knows the storm is coming. And what he's saying is like, man, let's start down this path now, before the cloud comes in, before the path is a little obscure, before we start tripping and falling. Because he knows, he fully believes, and he knows, and maybe we should learn to believe and respond too. He knows and believes that he has what we are after. He has what we know we need. He has the very thing that we are seeking, and he's here, and he's like, man, I want to give it to you so you don't have to go find it somewhere else. But the fact is, we must all come to the same realization in this, is that we are all lost. But Jesus wants to guide us home. We are all lost, but Jesus wants to guide us home. And for some of you, maybe that's in a big salvific way, where you know your home is not with Jesus. And maybe this morning you need to make a decision about changing that, because you're lost. We all are. And you need Jesus. But maybe for some of you, you're like, Mason, I already believe, I've been following him, but right now I'm in a situation that's just, it's a little unclear. I seem to have lost myself. I seem to have lost my way. And here's the encouraging thing. Jesus hasn't walked away and abandoned you. But even right now, he is still wanting to guide you through that season you're in. And I know that because I've been through those seasons. And he still promises, man, I want to guide you through this. Now here's the obvious, clear truth. Simply by the fact that I'm here means that we got help getting out of the woods. And it wasn't because we were like, man, I know better, or because I've had all this experience, or because I grew up in the mountains and things like that. No, we found a guide who was willing to say, man, I can help you out of this. And we followed him. Maybe some of you need that spiritually with Jesus today. Can you really be sure that the way you're going, the way you're doing things is going to get you home? Can you be sure that the direction you're going is going to lead you to where God has always intended you to be? And to be who God has always intended you to be? Or is it time that you responded to Jesus? He said, Jesus, man, I'm lost. And I need you. Everyone, please bow your heads and let's pray together. There are some of you in this room I know who do not have a relationship with Jesus. And maybe right now you've been convincing yourself that, man, you're not lost because of who you are, because of the family you grew up in, maybe because you went to church your entire life. And you've convinced yourself that you're not lost. Or you convince yourself that you're a good person because of your track record, because of your resume, because of all the many good things you do in this church or maybe in the community. And so you convince yourself, oh, I'm not lost. I've got this figured out. Well, maybe right now the Holy Spirit is saying something different. And saying that today you need to get right with God. And so in a moment, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to encourage you to pray along with me. And if that's your heart where you prayed this prayer, please come and talk to me afterwards, because we would love to get you baptized and move forward with this journey with you. But maybe for some of you, you're just like, man, I've fully believed, I've been following Jesus, but I'm a little lost right now in my marriage or my finances or my mental health or my emotional health or a situation in my life. I'm feeling a little lost right now. Maybe this is a time where you just need to, in a sense, offer that up to Jesus. Say to him, Jesus, man, I'm lost. And I know you see the end. So will you just take me by the hand and guide me towards the end that you want? Maybe for some of you, that's the prayer you need to pray right now. So I'm going to be silent for a moment and let you be honest with Jesus, and then I'm going to close us out in our prayer. Jesus, I'll be the first to admit that there are seasons I go through in life where I'm feeling a little lost. And there's a lot of pressure in this world to feel like you have all the answers, that you're strong, that you're capable, that you don't need any help. Gosh. Man, I know there are so many who feel the exact same way. But you have come for the lost. You've come for the sick and the broken. You have come for those who feel like, man, they are not who they are meant to be, or they've gotten a little off track. You've come for the people who are struggling in relationships and struggling with pain. And you don't condemn us, but you offer up a hand, saying that you want to guide us through this season. If we would just follow you as our King. And I know that there are people in this room who need to make a decision to say yes to you as their King. And then there are people in this room who just need to reaffirm that yes because of what they're going through right now. So I'm asking right now, would you please be with us? And when we stand up to sing, may we sing as those who know that we are found. That we may sing and worship you right now as people who know you are holding on to us. That you've got us. You're holding on to our hand, and you're going to guide us through this, because why? We've just declared that you are our King, and we are saying that we're lost, and we're willing to obey and follow you. We're not playing pretend. We're not hiding behind pride or the things that we've done. But we are recognizing that we need you. So please guide us, Father. It's in your name I pray. Amen.